Hello and most welcome to 1305. I will now make a comparison between the landscape problem that I mentioned in 1304, where we have a difficult result stemming from a fixed background, sort of the canvas of the Newtonian paradigm. And I will compare that to a special strand of cognitive science called action perception. This is one of the famous books in that strand by Al-Nui. And here there is a sort of an argument indirectly against a fixed observation that could be an object or a thing or a quality that is fixed, and then we have a fixed onlooker, observer. It could be a self or something else doing the other side of the pole. And there is quite definitely a very grand parallel here. And I think action perception means sensible things that are comparable to Lee Smolin. It means that reality is a movement, not a fixation. And if you remember what I draw 2 lectures ago with this flexible thing, without you clearly decide what is object and what is observer, and that it is the movement here that is the becoming, and here you find self and object. So let me get some pointers to introduce you to action perception, which is a bit hard to get in the beginning, I would say. It's counterintuitive without a doubt. This is not how we usually perceive these things. The fixated model is something that is self-evident in common parlance, without a doubt, without exaggerating. So let me lead you into it slowly. Let's go check my sugar level before starting. Looks grand. Affordances, accepting the opportunity. This is very fit. It's coming from sports psychology and sports cognition. This is the area which is most demanding on our capabilities and qualities. And this is where all the new stuff is developing. When it will reach the rest of the world, I don't know. But obviously what they found out within sports and cognition within sports cannot be completely disjunct to reality. And there's a small article by Shawn, Myszka. I think that will serve perfectly as a primer to get you in, and I will do a short summary at the end here at approximately the 45 minutes mark. Over the past 2 seasons here at Football Beyond Stats, I've tried to invigorate each one of our movement play of the week breakdowns by renewing our collective scopes of analysis by placing it onto the player environment relationship, while also imploring others to prioritize the problem and understand the powerful importance of information in the organization of movement behavior which emerges. To see what I mean, I invite you to take a trip down memory lane to see not only where we must have been, but also where we're aiming to go. Meaning, I believe we must continue to view things within our respective movement form of life, centered on these following emphasis. Respecting movement problem. Information is power. Through the use of both of those initiatives, I feel as though each of the movement analysis I have compiled here on the blog contain added depth and comprehensiveness. As well as enhanced potential practicality for all who would come across them. However, though I was pleased to see what has materialized and unfolded, and I'm excited about how my craft has grown due to what taking these two emphases have offered and required. I'm far from satisfied, and I know that there is still much farther that we can go as a community in our attempts to understand the phenomenon that is movement behavior emergence within sport. Because of that potential to understand more, and also because of where my personal interests currently are, it is my objective to ensure that on football we will add another layer to the discussion which could bring enhanced clarity to the sport movement analysis table. To do so, we will still maintain proper respect on the problem and the environment, while also attempting to answer questions about the nature and role of information in the coordination of movement. To set one thing to the stand and beginning is understanding affordances. This is how it all began with J. Gibson in 1966. First thing first, it's important to be clear as to what affordances actually are. Simply put, affordances are opportunities for action. They could also be viewed as invitation within the environment which are essentially beckoning a player to act in a certain fashion. These behavioral opportunities, known as affordances, really will refer to openings within a respective problem, which will serve to guide or channel the organization of movement behavior. That said, affordances do not cause the behavior, just constrain it. In this way, they will describe what an individual player can and cannot do in the environment. Why affordances? Many across the performance and movement skill communities have seemed to repeatedly balk at the use of and the need for the concept of affordances. Though I know that learning new terms and ideas is a bit intimidating for many. I also feel as though people are getting a bit too frazzled and quick to disregard the legitimate need for understanding how affordances live and breathe in the context of sport, movement, behavior, and in behaviors within life as a whole, for that matter. The late and great J.J. Gibson stated it much better than I could ever when he said, affordances refer to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the environment and the animal. If you have read any material housed under an ecological dynamics framework or anything remotely related to ecological psychology, you should recall that one of the key non-negotiable tenets of adhering to this approach is that the only appropriate scale of analysis for viewing movement, performance, is at the performer-environment relationship. Do remember this. This is a repetition of you cannot take the object out of what is observed. This is stated here in other words. Duly noted now. Thus, just as information links these two interdependent systems, information will also specify the behavioral solver. It's these affordances then, because they refer to the relation between the player and his environment, and between the disposition of the problem and the movement solution, ultimately organized, which become key to our analysis and understanding. In sum, affordances link sport movement problems and the functional movement solutions because they relate to the interactions between both sides and allow them to become one with another. Said another way, affordances capture the reciprocity of the player-environment system. Additionally, as Turvey and Shaw has put it, they provide functional semantics for sport, because they are a way of describing the environment to the player in terms of how she can behave within it. Capturing the mutual reciprocal relationships doesn't stop at the player and the environment though. Affordances also consider perception and action, and I would argue cognition and intention jointly, and capture the tight coupling that exists here. This is imperative to the way that I aim to unpack the authentic movement problem-solving process of players during our top play each Sunday. Namely, the movement behaviors and the integration of perceptions, intentions, and actions. I will add myself thoughts, will be reflected within the selection and realization of the affordances accepted. Turvey went on to say the theory of affordances is ideally suited to capture the behavior of athletes on the playing field, and has great potential to become a guiding principle for research on perception and action in sport. How so? Well, it's important to remember that affordances will emerge and decay. They will come and go, appear and disappear. Because of this, they can give us an understanding about the dynamical changes in the relation between how the problem is unfolding moment to moment, while also highlighting the role of the player in this constant interaction. In these ways, affordances are both frame dependent and individual dependent. What this all means to us in our upcoming movement analysis is extremely promising, particularly as it relates to the qualitative and subjective properties of the player environment system that I hold near and dear to my heart. Overall, I believe that affordances gives us another way of viewing the problem-solution interaction and interface, or the perceptual motor workspace, if you prefer. And the information exchanged within this interactive relationship. Let's remember that the information which specifies the affordances is deep, rich, and meaningful, in relation to the actor, doing the perceiving and acting. Additionally, that actor player's movement behavior is always going to be dependent on the circumstances he is facing, which is unfolding in front of and around him. Well, as the player acts, this gives rise to numerous other opportunities, affordances, for subsequent action in both an online and prospective fashion. As I have said before, emergent movement problem solving is really at the center of the reciprocal relationship between the player and the environment. And the affordances will be at the heart of this movement problem solving. Landscape of affordances. Where I was going above should be kept in mind. Tighter perception, action coupling processes is really about how movement behaviors emerge under constraints and how the affordances will allow us to capture the dynamics of these interactions. Namely, the player's perception will not only be of information, but also of affordances as well. With exposure and experience and learning, players become more sensitively attuned to what opportunities in the environment offer to them. As mentioned earlier, intentions cannot be disconnected from the behavior organization process either. Namely, ideas of skilled intentionality or the openness and responsiveness to a rich landscape of affordances will be at play here to allow the player to better link themselves to the possibilities present in the world. Finally, actions will be calibrated and organized based on the affordance selected. In this way, the information that needs to be detected will also be that which allows for the control and regulation of the movement. For example, to perceive a gap between defenders, a player will need to pick up information as to if the distance between two defenders is possible for him and to act accordingly upon that affordance. To execute in an appropriate movement strategy that is coordinated in relation to the gap. One will need to be able to perceive the exact same information. Of course, this brings us to an item of note that makes the concept of affordances unique. The role of action capabilities or the effectivities of the player in the perception of opportunities. Namely, for an opportunity to be inviting to a player, the individual must possess the ability to act upon it, such as in the gap example above. The player must have an adequate amount of speed to pass through the gap before it closes, and that is of course a spatial and temporal gap. This is how the affordances would relate the opportunities in the environment to that of the movement performance characteristics of that player. Obviously then, the affordances which can be detected, that is perceived, in the first quarter of a game may be significantly different than those which are picked up in the fourth quarter. It should go without saying that any moment in time there will be both simultaneous and successive affordances being offered to the player. This frame dependence will be important to our movement analysis. Obviously, on a given play, we will never truly be able to perceive what the player is perceiving, what information they are picking up, or think what he is thinking, and truly know how he aims to act. But through the affordances he accepts and acts upon, we will at least be able to get a speculative glimpse into his movement behavior. My friend Matt Caraccio, a super innovative thinker and football scout, and host of the Saturday Sunday football podcast, has a great analogy for a performer interacting with this landscape of affordances, in which he compares it to a surfer riding a wave. The ocean with its waves are constantly changing, not fixed. Will be the dynamic backdrop to numerous and various affordances to a respective surfer based on the individual's dynamic movement behaviors and authentic skill set. As part of this landscape of affordances and the various opportunities which will be presented to a player simultaneously and successively, lies the idea of nested affordances. Here we will be investigating and referring to the more micro problems which will be solved en route to solving the more macro problem. These nested affordances are really about the perspective and online control of movement, and how the totality of the contextual circumstances are unfolding moment by moment based on the behavioral opportunities presented to the player. Especially in a sport like American football, solving the immediate micro-problem that is represented by perceiving and accepting a nested affordance can be dependent on what it will allow for the solving of a more global macro problem. Meaning, affordances can be selected based on the information about the next affordance. So the player is actually acting relative to multiple affordances simultaneously. Think of Barry Sanders here for a moment. Barry was obviously notorious for making guys miss across all kinds of situations. Well, upon closer investigation, we find that Barry was often accepting affordances. For instance, make this defender miss by going in X's direction at X time, utilizing X movement strategy based on what was unfolding in the existence in other areas of the landscape of affordances. That is, movement problems behind and or around the immediate defender. You can liken these nested affordances to that of a door containing numerous locks, all of which can equally unlock the door, which is the macro problem, as long as the individual has that particular key to it. The individual does not have to open every lock to be able to open the door and walk through it. Just the one that fits best for that moment in time for him as a player. Sharing is caring. You probably heard this old cliche before. Football is the ultimate team game, meaning a player's interactions with his teammates is a major determining factor in the movement behavior which emerges. Just as an athlete can become perceptually attuned to subtle differences in problems like that of the opponent's movement behavior, it's also important that players become connected and sensitive to how their teammates could potentially behave and act. though I have often highlighted the role of shared affordances in my analysis over the years, with this year's new priority being placed on the concept of affordances as a whole, how one interacts with the opportunities both of and for his teammates will be at the center of many of the forthcoming discussions. Quick affordance illustration. Though as the season goes on, there will be a great deal more which we'll unpack in expressing where affordances live and breathe on a football field. Let's quickly consider an example here now before we wrap things up for today. The composition and layout of the environment can begin to constitute what opportunities are afforded. Gibson often used certain examples from everyday life, such as if a surface is walk-on-able, that is, it affords support for a human for locomotive purposes, or if a tree is climbable, the branches are sturdy and structured in a way that offers the opportunity for a human to traverse it upwards. These Gibson illustrations are just simple examples, while within sport, with the dynamic and complex world athletes exist in and interact with. The illustrations may be less obvious at a time, and we can go much deeper down a speculative rabbit hole. However, one thing remains clear. Different layouts of the macro problem can afford different behaviors for different players. And this in turn will equate to different interactions and relations. This should be obvious in the quick examples we will utilize below. Of course, in the sport of football, there are 11 opponent players on the other side of the ball who are operating in a way that opposes the potential behavioral opportunities for the featured player, while 10 other players who are potentially and hopefully organizing their movements behaviors in a way that affords more advantageous opportunities for the featured player. As Gibson had stated, behavior affords behavior. In other words, the affordance points both ways, to the player and to the environment, as well as between a player and his adversaries. Take a quick look at this third-person view of Saquon Barkley as he stares at the landscape of affordances at this moment in time. Obviously, some of that which will be perceived and the affordances being offered and ultimately acted upon are going to be dependent on the particular play call. However, for the sake of illustration, try to put yourself in the movement system of Saquon himself. Think to yourself, what potential affordances could Saquon be perceiving? As you work your way through those potential affordances, what information within the problem do you believe he was connecting to in order to couple the coordination of his movement behavior in relation with? How was this pickup being influenced by certain extrinsic factors? Score, quarter and time of the game, down, distance, offensive play call, defensive tactics being played, opponents' characteristics, etc. Now to partake in a little thought experiment to further put yourself to the test of application of the concepts of affordances. Take a quick peek at the tremendous play by my eventual mover of the year, Lamar Jackson, when he faced the Kansas City Chiefs. In the post, scroll down to the information and affordances section, where I highlight the various local problems of significance. Here it becomes more and more obvious that perception is created in the process of action. Action and perception are the same thing. Things are coming into existence by the coupling of movement and intention. This is the creator of everything, because affordances means everything. In the quotes of J. Gibson, affordances are miraculous in the context. They have no limits. And I will give an example here. It shows that in extraordinary situations, the Newtonian paradigm sort of flies away, because we know this fixed background, or taken as a cognition science aspect, fixed observation and onlooker-observer duality is loosened. Everything can happen. Here is a story from Washington Post. Zach Clark is a hero. Zach Clark is a sophomore football player at Clear Fork High School in Belleville, Ohio. And last weekend he saved his neighbor's life. Clark was outside with his mother, Laura, working in her flower beds. He noticed his neighbor working under his Volkswagen. Clark then heard a loud bang and screams from his neighbor's wife. The car had slipped off the jack stand and was crushing the man's chest. Clark said, I turned around and I saw him struggling. Instincts kicked in and I just ran over there. And I just thought I had to get the car off him. I did get it off him a bit, and his wife and my mum pulled him out from under it. Next thing you know, he rushed to hospital. Clark's neighbor is now home, resting comfortably. Doctors later told him he would have died had Clark not been there. I have always wanted to be a firefighter and help people out, Clark said. The first thing that came to my mind was to get over there and do what I can do, and do anything I can to help. But it's all about people helping people. The adrenaline kicked in. I got the car up a little bit and we got him out. This is from the article of Washington Post, and I've been checking from certain sites. This is testified to by many people, but it should be duly noted that the car he lifted weighed no less than 1 ton. It is absolutely impossible for a human being in sports or any other activity to lift 1 ton. And still, these things comes about. It reminds me of experiences I had when I was traveling earlier on in India. In India, it took only 2 days before I saw something that defied all concepts of what should be doable. It was a person that stopped his own breath. And in the beginning, I was completely fascinated by these odd happenings. And after a couple of months, I got adjusted to it. It became like part of reality. But how odd. And definitely, even in the article, is no mentioning that this is not something that is possible according to the fixed background of the Newtonian paradigm. You cannot lift something that weighs a ton. That's absolutely impossible. You cannot even lift something that weighs half a ton. It will not move. But I saw things, I saw people lifting things that weighed over 400 or 500 kilos to move them about. And I also saw people that were incredibly sick being healed by others, the so-called siddhis. And when I got back, I was wondering what happened to all those things, because they are absolutely, apart from these few instances, non-existent in our world. What makes up that difference? And since we've been discussing Lee Smolin earlier, he shows that some fallacies have changed the way we perceive things, how our experience are. Could it be that our experience itself blocks out these possibilities that I saw in India? They didn't even believe these things to be extraordinary or anything to pay attention to. I have never in the West seen anything that defied the laws of nature, the fixed background. Neither have I heard of about anybody who's seen those things, at least not testified properly. Whereas in India I saw at least 50 cases during that half year I was there. I think this is in place and it will have effects on how the world is working, because this is actually part of affordances. It's part of what is doable. The old idea is that everything viewable is outside, and that the intrinsic properties of a cup or a thermos or what have you, or the trees outside are somehow fixed. They are not. They are coupled with the affordances we have, are, so to speak, potentials for perception. Therefore, it shows that perception is not something absolutely given. It is not something destined to happen. We are a part of the equation. And this is what I liked in this blog article. He expresses it as the coupling between the player or the actor and the environment. Whereas we in the West, apart from science of cognition, apart from neurology, in all other types of knowledge, we assume the world to be out there, and we can sort of map it precisely. And the more we map it, the more we know. Affordances and the current physics, the quantum mechanics, is in sharp contrast, because it puts affordances into the game. What you experience, how you made up, will change perception and reality. And this is maybe the first time I get a good explanation what I saw in India. It's been puzzling me ever since, and I also realized, especially since reading Smoling and Unger, that I've been sort of stuck in this, because before you point it out, you will not understand that you are projecting things into a fixed background, the landscape. And as recently, for only 3 days ago, I had a discussion about quantum mechanics. I can actually show how that worked. It is called decoherence, and is that you put quantum mechanics into the world and sort of they disappear. They become statistical or stochastic, and no longer do we have these odd effects. How come? And in this discussion I had no answer, but I was certain, and this is when you read a book or you get into a subject, you get a sort of an intuition, but you cannot at the beginning verbalize it or tell it to somebody else. So I had a hint that he was wrong, but the understanding came to me recently, I think it's yesterday. What he did, and everyone else is doing by using the term decoherence, is to put quantum mechanics into the landscape. I didn't realize that. And Smolin is, together with Unger, the only one that sort of uncovered this patiently, bit by bit. Yes, in the beginning it wasn't even interesting. It seemed to be such a small thing compared to Heisenberg's uncertainty problem, or why not the double slit experiment, double slot experiment. But it is incredibly interesting, because it makes the whole difference. All of a sudden, I start feeling I've been tricking myself. And you don't know these things. And this is extremely close to that happening in Brussels almost 100 years ago, when Albert Einstein presented something to the group of Bohr, the defenders of quantum mechanics as we know it. And they were gobsmacked. They were dissolute. They thought really quantum mechanics was supposed to die that day or that week. But it turned out Einstein himself, unwillingly, unbeknownst, had forgotten the landscape, because it is very tough to reveal that there is a fixatedness which everything is projected. And I would say this is very similar how we see objects as being fixed. And when we start to see objects as being fixed, we get the fixed observer, the self, me as a person doing perception. And what did I get now? I get the classical idea of perception. And I and all the other senses taking in solely. This was the dominant idea of perception in the science of cognition until 2002, I'd say. This is dominant. Why? Because there is a fixatedness here on this side, objects, and here, the subject side. And naturally, that idea comes to life. And the more you sort of investigate this idea, the more stuck you will become into it. And you will not even feel the stuckedness. But it doesn't hold true at all. Although a lot of philosophy has been based on this distinction. Hume, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, all of them were absolutely convinced by this absolute distinction. It's a distinction that is made by fixation in understanding itself, in knowledge itself. It's not constructed of a certain person. This is how knowledge in our hemisphere have developed naturally. It is natural, it is absolutely workable, but it is a fallacy. And that fallacy changes everything. It changes even how the world is. It changes the possibility to lift a car that weighs a ton. And I got fascinated. I had a hard time getting back here with all these stories. But one of the best ones was Onbashi Chehar in the First World War. And in the action, in the war, he was lifting the grenades to his enormous gun by himself. Each grenade weighed 270 kilos. And this was witnessed by over 100 people. 270 kilos. He put them into the gun, he fired them himself, and they were directed to the British fleet. The first two shells missed barely HMS Princess, but the third one came just below waterline. It struck perfectly in the battleship and it sank it. One man sank a whole battleship. And later they wanted to interview Onbashi Chehar, and they asked him to lift one of those grenades. He couldn't. They presented a grenade that weighed half. He couldn't lift it. In the end, they had to make a replica of wood. So the photographs is him lifting the replica of wood. And then he said, and this became almost a half famous quote, "I could probably lift the shells once more, were there to be war once more." And this goes to show it's a fixed background that changes experience. Reality gets changed. Isn't this marvelous? And it's a shame it's only used in this small niche of science of sports, baseball, football, basketball, tennis, swimming, I heard. Some more sports where teams are very important. Isn't it interesting? I think it's time to round up. I say thank you very much for your patience. Have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.